And I'm mostly interested in the 19th century and the colonial encounter, and how the colonial encounter is, in fact, actually, of course, completely always present. So we can look at 19th century Orientalist photographs and these fantasizing spaces. For example, you can think about the long 19th century tradition of the zoo and the display. There's a long tradition of the display of Africans in Europe as, you know, exotic objects, you know, the violence that was done to Africa through the display of creating this voyeuristic space. Of course, what's interesting is that there's a complete amnesia in the contemporary world now of that history, as if it never happened, especially in Europe, in Germany also. I mean, I know a little bit more of the German as opposed to the Scandinavian context, where people act as if that never happened. In fact, you know, famously Germans always forget that there was a colonial history, that they even had colonies. You know, oh, well, we never touched any of that. You know, we have our own problems known as World War II, but thank God we didn't have colonialism. But of course they did. And of course what's interesting is that, you know, oftentimes we look at the 19th century past and say, oh, these things were in the past, now things are much better. But, you know, when you teach, or when I teach my students, and you think of the concept of primitivism, which you think of, you know, either connected to the 19th century or early 20th century avant-garde modernism, and you see it as a necessary but past way of Europeans being able to account for or understand Africa. Of course, it's a completely reductive and problematic position to take, because, of course, there was no, to justify it, you know, through the notion of encounter, bleeds it of its violence. So you're reducing it actually to this aesthetic event, or, well, this was necessary for the creation of modern art, which never acknowledges the violence, and also never acknowledges the fact that that history has never left us, that the notion and the act and the practice of primitivism is alive and well, probably more so than ever. Parochial projects like, you know, strange zoos in the metropole, the colonial metropole in Britain, in England, in England, in Germany. In some ways, of course, at least in that case, they were localized. They were small provincial projects in the sense that they were only viewed by Germans, and they were only viewed, let's say, by people who were going to, you know, living in the city. What's absurd and interesting and problematic now is that, you know, stereotypical fetishizing, primitivizing, ahistoricizing images of Africa and Africans are now consumed on a much larger, more pervasive level, because, you know, they're just floating around, you know, in that, you know, space of, you know, global digital communication networks. So, you know, this idea that we have that we're beyond that. I also get that, you know, a lot from my students, like looking at the 19th century and looking at the colonial period, or looking at, you know, the so-called European avant-garde encounter with African art a la Picasso, as if, you know, the stereotyping and the problematic aspect of it is beyond, like we have moved beyond that doesn't exist anymore. But of course that's totally not the case. In some ways it's more pervasive and more caricatured and more visualized. We live in such a densely visualized culture that the stereotypical images of Africa are more powerful and more pervasive than they were even at the height of colonialism, you know. So in some ways it's, you know, it's worse than it's ever been.